Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's Book Talk with Jeff Makala today. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Lauren Hughes, and I'm the Vice President for Collections and the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Graphic Arts here at AAS. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that we have been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and have resonance for our own day today. Today's program is sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. The virtual book talk series showcases authors of recently published scholarly monographs broadly related to book history and print culture. Today, I'm joined behind the scenes by my colleague, Amanda Kondek, who is our programs coordinator. She'll be posting relevant information in the chat throughout the program. We're going to have time for audience questions later in the program, so please post your questions in the Q&A function. We are recording this program, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel next week. We thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. So Jeff, I'm going to ask you to turn on your video and get ready. There you are. I see you. Dr. Jeff Makala is Associate Director for Special Collections and University Archivist at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. He has degrees from Colgate, the University of Illinois, Trinity College, and a PhD in English from the University of South Carolina. He has written on 19th century American literature and book history in the papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, Literature and History, Printing History, and the Oxford Companion to the Book. He is the co-editor of Archive, South American Poetry since 2005. He co-edited the first comprehensive anthology of American literature about dogs, In Dogs We Trust, an anthology of American dog literature. And his book, the one we're talking about today, Publishing Plates, Stereotyping and Electrotyping in 19th Century U.S. Print Culture, was just recently published by Penn State University. So recently, we don't even have a copy yet. So, but if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, a 30% discount code has been put into the chat. And with that, happy news for people who like to buy books. I will turn this over to you, Jeff, and I look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. Can you hear me okay? Is everything coming through all right? Great. Our Furman groundskeepers are cutting grass right outside the library right now because you can do that in December in South Carolina. So hopefully that's not too much of an interference. I'd also like to just give a great round of thanks to the American Antiquarian Society. Kevin contacted me over the summer to set this up, which was wonderful, a pleasant surprise. And Amanda Kondek has been great in getting everything set up. And I should also give a retrospective shout out to Paul Erickson, your former director of academic programs, because many, many years ago now, he arranged me to stay at Reese House for a couple of weeks and put in some good quality research time at AAS right at the beginnings of this project. And of course, I repaid the favor by going ahead to Philadelphia and writing all about Matthew Carey instead of Isaiah Thomas. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. And it's great that the program and the history of the book in American culture has been revived and hopefully is thriving now. It was such an important thing when it came out and started producing scholarship and conferences and all sorts of good things. So it's great to have it back and especially gratifying for me to be part of it. So I thank you all for that. I think I'd like to start just for the non-19th century book nerds on the audience and just define stereotyping very quickly and electrotyping, and then move into the introduction, and I could sort of set the intellectual theoretical framework for the book and talk a little bit about the chapter progression, where it goes. And then after that, I have two examples or case studies or stories really to tell that I think will help illuminate some of the big questions and issues that I've been working with and hopefully concluding a little bit about in the book, and then leave time for questions. So stereotyping, its companion process electrotyping, was a way of creating some sort of printing plate from set type, loose type that's set up in a form, and instead of being printed from, that form was then used to generate a plate a reverse image, a mold that was then filled in to make a plate, shaved and beveled and set up into type height with blocks of mahogany or brass and printed from. And the experiments that we know in printing history in the West go way back, right to the first, really. And Paul Needham and other people have written about how Gutenberg potentially, with the Catholicon, used sand casting of slug and of type and made slugs or individual sentences and words out of type. And there were Dutch experiments in the 17th century. People were trying to take a form of set loose type and then solder the underside of it together to create some sort of a large block of things. And there are experiments in the 18th century in England and in Scotland and in France. But what happens, the advantages are several, certainly, if one could afford the upfront cost of making a plate. And the most immediate advantage was warehousing. If you make plates from your set type, you could then warehouse the plates instead of warehousing printed stock, which was, of course, a tremendous amount of capital tied up in paper and warehoused in potentially flammable environments. Blocks of metal stored in wooden crates in the basement could be a little bit easier to be long-term investments of something that would be regularly printed. So stereotyping, its companion process, electrotyping, started in the 1830s, perfected in the 1850s, and it was just another one of those technological advances where a form of set type was introduced into a metal solution in a liquid with dissolved copper atoms, and electricity passed through it. And then the copper atoms formed a very thin surface on top of the set type forms, and a mold was generated in order to create then another printing plate. So we're talking about printing with plates here. And I'll just shorthand it by saying stereotyping when I really might mean stereotyping and or electrotyping in the 19th century. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is really early 19th century, so it is truly stereotyping. So I'm going to go and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Is that coming through? Okay, great. So, okay. In 1832, the mathematician, economist, and computing pioneer, Charles Babbage, published a long treatise titled On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures. At the end of one of his early chapters that was called Of Copying, Babbage invited his readers to consider the printed letter forms that made up the book that they held right now in their hands. The page before them, he said, was the final product of 6 successful stages of copying. The initial carving of a punch, the creation of a matrix, the casting of type from that matrix, the forming of a plaster mold from the set type of the book's page, the casting of a stereotype plate from the mold, and then finally, the reverse impression of that plate made in ink on paper, the paper that one was reading in their hand right now. And these 6 steps basically summarize the mechanical processes needed to print a book in 1832 using this new process of stereotyping. I'm going to advance. Babbage chose his example of these new developments in type founding and printing technologies carefully. He wanted his readers to pause and to consider the hidden nature of printing and print culture in everyday life. And he wanted to highlight a significant new technological advance in an old artisan and new industrial practice, one that had always sought manufacturing consistency and uniformity of output as its 2 primary measures of pride and accomplishment. The complex set of skilled industrial processes required to print a book was not usually noticed by the consumer, who only judged the finished product against a world of similar printed matter. Machine parts and other objects of industrial manufacture, such as pieces of type and stereotype plates, they had to be precise copies of one another in order to maximize manufacturing productivity and uniformity in output. And likewise, the advances in printing technologies, that incorporated these new stages of copying, in effect complicating the manufacturing process, show how relatively soon after their adoption, something approaching perfection, not there quite yet, but might be achieved. A perfection potentially applicable to all forms of industrial manufacturing. And it's here that the significant that in creating the stereotype mold from the standing type, the fourth of Babbage's 6 stages, he goes in reverse here, so it's the 3rd step. But he says that it's the stage at which the union of the intellectual and the mechanical take place. And I love that phrase. Babbage's example helps frame the subject of my book on both its scope and its aims. The invention and the rapid adoption of stereotyping in the late 18th and early 19th centuries constitute, I would argue, the first significant change in printing technology since European printing with movable type was perfected in the 15th century. Just as Babbage showed his readers how the products of technological advancement lay essentially hidden in everyday life, so too has the process of creating and using stereotype plates received insufficient attention from bibliographers, historians of technology, textual critics, and literary historians. So my aim here is to explore several aspects of a larger series of questions concerning the early adoption, uses, and significance of the shift from printing exclusively from standing type to printing with stereotype plates in the United States. And that happens from the period 1810 to 1850, roughly. Using methodologies and critical specters from analytical bibliography and new work in the history of the book, I also consider the greater cultural significance of stereotypes and other types of plates. In this newly emergent culture of plates within the framework of American studies and material culture studies in 19th century America. So the widespread adoption of stereotype plates fundamentally changed the way in which books and later periodicals and newspapers were printed. Book historian John Carter, who I'm sure you all know and love, calls it the only one radical invention in printing to take place between the work of Gutenberg in the mid-15th century and the shift to photomechanical composition in the mid to late 20th centuries. The commissioning of plates by printers and publishers altered shop practices, altered distribution methods, the relationship between authors and publishers, and labor and management issues in the printing trades. A new secondhand market in stereotype plates developed, I'll talk about a little bit later, that would further complicate the production, reprinting, and distribution of books and material texts throughout the 19th century. By 1840, stereotyping was firmly established as a cost-effective model for many genres of printed matter, and a more diverse array of steady sellers, including novels and some periodicals, were also beginning to be stereotyped. Later in the century, with the advent of high-volume power presses, newspapers would use stereotyping and curved plates to print copies of the same edition of a newspaper, often employing multiple sets of the same plate on multiple presses running at the same time, which sped up the printing and distribution process dramatically. The London Times was printing 100,000 copies overnight using their power plates on, and distributing it to every corner of the UK from within hours. So the growth and development of printing with plates also has implications for our understanding of some broader topics in the study of 19th century print culture, such as practices of reprinting, the significance and the growth of religious publishing, the role of serials, and also our understanding of a transatlantic literary culture that relates to the transmission and distribution of texts that moves from the United States to Europe as much as from Europe to the United States. So, in this 30-year period between 1810 and 1840, the printing trades and nascent publishing industry in the United States underwent a series of transformations that changed how books and other printed matter were created. These transformations changed notions of authorship and reading practices and began to break down an artisan-based model of printing and publishing that dated to the late medieval, early modern period. In a short amount of time, the introduction of power presses, the adoption of stereotyping, the introduction of machine-made paper, and the growth and consolidation of local printers into regional and national publishers all presented challenges and opportunities to an existing trade, the localized artisan craft practices of which had not fundamentally changed since the earliest days of European printing. All of these innovations became market-ready, at least for some well-capitalized printers, in this 30-year period of 1810 to 1840. The most successful printers amassed capital, some of it in the form of stereotype plates, and secured wider distribution networks for their output, allowing them rightfully to be called publishers in the modern sense. Newly formed organizations such as the American Bible Society and the American Sunday School Union immediately grasped the ways in which these innovations in speed, size, and reach could allow them to dramatically increase the scale and impact of their mission to produce and distribute printed scripture to the nation's citizens. This calculated growth and innovation of regional printing and publishing businesses during this time, together with their successes and failures, paved the way for the large-scale, nationally focused commercial publishing houses that would emerge in the United States by mid-century. So this book, my book, investigates the development and the significance of stereotyping and electrotyping in the United States, primarily through the lens of book history and literary studies. It argues that stereotyping was the most significant of these early 19th century innovations that helped the large-scale nationally based publishing industry in the United States to emerge by 1850. If the publisher made the right choice of title and followed the right business model, investing in stereotype plates could secure a greater market share and provide years of cheap reprints. If they chose to publish the wrong text, it could tie up significant amounts of capital better used elsewhere. As some local printers grew into regional and national publishers, the decisions about when and how to invest in new technology became crucial to their growth and success. This book explores some of those decisions, including several unsuccessful ones. And by mining the archives of 19th century US printers and publishers, a detailed picture emerges of individual reactions to technological changes and disruptions in the printing trades, and of how American printing and publishing grew into the industry it is today. So Eileen Fife in England has recently argued, and I agree, that technological changes in the printing trades during the 19th century are often alluded to in other works of printing history, but exactly how they occurred on the ground is still a little studied. This book is one attempt to help correct that a little bit. And as the book is primarily concerned with the meanings generated by the introductions of this new physical object, the stereotype plate, into a long-established profession, an object that contains both textual and symbolic meaning, in addition to embodied capital, it's important to consider the increased critical attention to how material objects resonate and create new interpretive meanings as individuals interact with them. Anthropological and historical studies of objects have become commonplace in the last couple decades, often grouped into, for better or worse, into material culture studies as a field, but objects and their meanings are also the subject of increased attention by literary scholars and cultural theorists as well. Thing theory was a recent thing about 10 years ago that took over some aspects of literary study. But this book then is necessarily informed by critical studies also in the history of technology. The printing historian Jessica Despain recently discussed the work of film scholar Rick Altman, talking about, quote, the social interplay that occurs between the creation of new technologies and human usage of them. Altman refers to this approach as crisis historiography, which I like a lot. It understands that the uses of technology are socially constructed, and they are both, quote, ongoing and multiple. The technology is never socially constructed once and for all. During a crisis, a technology is understood in varying ways, resulting in modification not only of the technology itself, but also of terminology, exhibition practices, and audience attitudes. And I found this a really solid theoretical underpinning for a lot of what I'm thinking about and talking about. Because the introduction of stereotype plates offered printers new options for reprinting, for investment, and the expansion of their trade, the crisis they faced in the form of decisions on how best to employ plates and the texts that they chose to have cast into plates fits very well into this model of crisis historiography. The multiple ways in which printers and publishers understood the significance of this new technology, its potential and its limitations, and how this understanding continued to evolve and change over time drives this study. Okay, so these are some of the theoretical decisions that sort of underlie what I've been thinking about. The technological changes that are examined in this book are fully embedded within the cultures of the early US Republic, in the artisan-based apprentice model of labor found in the printing trades in the modern West, and in all their accompanying ideologies, again, for better or for worse, the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment enshrinement of reason and progress, Protestant work ethic, and the seemingly unlimited potential for human advancement offered by the boundless new American continent in the early Republic. But the ways in which this technology was deployed, as this book shows and considers, were not at all monolithic or straightforward, nor are these ideologies without inherent contradictions, problematic aspects, and disastrous consequences for those without political or economic influence, such as Native Americans and enslaved and free Black citizens. So by looking at printing, publishing, and authorship through a materialist lens, focused on the plates that enabled these changes to occur and the people who used them and reacted to them, I think we can better understand some of the transformations that took place in the printing trades and the nascent publishing industry in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Okay. There ends the theoretical part of the talk. We can talk more on the ground now. In the first chapter, I trace the European origins of the process of casting plates from set type and their first successful realizations in the United States, drawing a parallel between the multiple origin stories of printing itself to the multiple national origin stories of stereotyping, which compete and form nationalist bodies of thought. This chapter brings together for the first time all the earliest mentions of stereotyping in the United States in printing trade manuals and popular literature, including newspaper advertisements. It describes the first successful uses of stereotype casting in New York City in the 18-teens and 1820s, the interconnections amongst the earliest American typefounders, stereotypers, and printers, and stereotype's first introduction into the printing trades proper at that time. The second chapter focuses on the business practices of the Philadelphia publisher Matthew Carey, excuse me, as he navigated a changing national marketplace in quarto Bibles between 1813 and 1824. Carey already owned one of the only complete Bibles in standing type in this country. Isaiah Thomas had another. Complete forms of set type, 1,000 pages, ready to be printed from. Tremendous expenditure of type being tied up, literally tied up and waiting to be printed from which he could print as many copies as he needed. And so the introduction of stereotyped Bibles by several New York type founders in the mid-1810s complicated his market dominance and his investment. As the production of multiple sets of quarto Bible plates threatened to upend the market, Carey was forced to make some hard decisions about acquiring some of these sets for his own use and potentially undercutting his own market share. He was also forced to react to increasing competition from the same product, literally the exact same product, being produced by competitors and using a new technology. The third chapter goes outward a little bit more, looking to the work and the influence of the New York-based American Bible Society, whose businessmen founders eagerly embraced new advances in the printing trades to enhance their mission to produce and distribute cheap Bibles to the young nation. The ABS was founded in 1816. The timing is auspicious, expressly because its founders knew that stereotype Bibles could spread the gospel quickly and efficiently and cheaply. Evangelical organizations like the ABS and the American Sunday School Union were the first nonprofit groups to adopt stereotyping to further their publishing goals, effectively creating the first mass media organizations in the United States. For the ABS managers, the ownership of the means to reproduce the word at will was as much a sign of God's providence as it was a technological or scientific advance. And so this chapter explores the printing and business practices of the American Bible Society as they commissioned and amassed multiple sets of stereotype plates from 1816 into the 1830s. By looking closely at the ABS's work, we can better understand the newly emergent marketplace in stereotype plates, the risks and rewards of being early adopters of new printing technologies, and also the ways in which the ABS's calculated growth and innovation became models for the large-scale commercial publishers that would emerge in the United States at mid-century. Following chapter 4 goes further outward in scope and range, looking at the afterlife of stereotype plates as they were sold, exchanged, auctioned, and used to create multiple published editions over time. It investigates advertisements in the printing trades and publishing industry literature and looks closely at used sets of plates that were offered for sale at the industry trade sales between 1824 and 1900. Sets of plates were sources of capital for publishers. They were also, for the first time, I might argue, true material texts. The physical embodiment of an authorial work and a self-contained, portable source of reproductive value. Reference works in scripture mostly lack copyright protection, but some new works that were cast into plates were often sold or auctioned with their copyrights intact, offering second-tier or regional publishers the opportunity to acquire a relatively recent work to reprint. And then some texts, as I'm going to talk about in one of my examples, had very long afterlives as they were bought, sold, reprinted, and printed from many times over the years by increasingly down-market publishers. And then the final chapter, chapter 5, examines some of the cultural changes caused by the introduction of stereotyping and stereotype plates into literary circles in the American lexicon and language, and the broader cultural landscape of 19th century America, including African-American authorship and publishing. Edgar Allan Poe, for example, advocated for the process of anastatic printing as a way for authors to essentially self-stereotype their own writings and reconnect with their reading public, excluding publishers entirely. Walt Whitman wrote, quote unquote, of making poems, both as a poet, but also quite literally as the initiator and owner of the stereotype plates for Leaves of Grass. Thoreau, an author whose livelihood and family prosperity were deeply embedded in the supply chains of the stereotyping and electrotyping industries through their involvement with graphite and plumbago, Thoreau also evolved his own literary uses of the term stereotype in his writings and his journal. Common language quickly appropriated stereotype and stereotyping from terms specific to the printing industry to synonyms for copying, and then finally to the pejorative definition that we understand it to be used as today. And finally, this chapter looks at the experiences of the authors Sojourner Truth and William Wells Brown and their intimate connections to the stereotype plates of their own narratives and identities, and considers the ways in which embodied forms of authorship in the form of plates could serve as vehicles for liberation, independence, and justice. So together, these chapters explore a changing technological world in the printing and publishing industry in the 19th century United States, and the ways in which the introduction of stereotyping affected the broader cultural landscape. This book examines how the printing and publishing worlds of the area reacted to change, how individuals, businesses, and organizations use these new technologies to further their aims, how the cultures of plates that emerged had broader meanings that rippled out and influenced popular culture, everyday life, and language through their ultimate products, printed material texts. This new understanding of the role of material texts pervades 19th century American culture, from the physicality and ubiquity of the plates themselves to the popular uses of the term stereotyping as a metaphor for the expansiveness and the limitations of rapid technological change. Okay, so I would like to kind of break from the written text a little bit and talk briefly two stories that are contained in the book, starting with Matthew Carey in Philadelphia. So Carey, by 1803, had owned two complete Bibles that were set up in standing type, a quarto family Bible, so the large lectern-sized book in which families recorded births, deaths, and marriages, and also a duodecimo school Bible, pocket-sized for personal uses in schools. The duodecimo pocket Bible he had purchased from the New York printer Hugh Gain previously, and Hugh Gain had imported it from England in the 1790s. Isaiah Thomas also maintained several Bibles in standing type at this time. Carey innovated by selling his Bibles by subscription to rural America through networks of traveling agents, and he also sold his family Bibles in a variety of different options and prices. And here is one example of that. On different papers and different choices of binding, with or without maps, illustrations, or commentary, and supplementary material. These are 2 pages from his one of his catalogs of publications from, I think, 1815. And you can see at the bottom of the first image and the whole second image are all variants on family Bibles, all printed from the same setting of standard type. Different papers, with or without apocrypha, plates, psalms, concordances, etc., from 375 all the way up to a very substantial $18 for Morocco-bound, gilt-edged everything, deluxe edition, a fairly substantial sum of money in 1815. Carey had purchased the stereotype plates to a New Testament from a New York stereotyping firm in 1814 and promptly warehoused it. He already had a New Testament set up in standing type. He didn't need to use it or print from it, so he simply bought it to get it out of the marketplace. And this is a practice that's going to continue for a number of publishers in this first 10-year period when new sets of multiple plates are being produced by typefounders and then being offered to printers up and down the East Coast. By 1816, a New York firm of Collins and Company, typefounders, began to stereotype their own complete quarto Bible, so directly competing with Carey. The firm was quick to announce this to the trade, to claim American precedent for the first stereotype family Bible in America, and also to identify potential purchasers for their plates. They wrote to Carey, saying around this time, in February 1815, about the new venture, and I'm quoting here, "We do not expect to have any Bibles furnished from our stereotype plates in under 5 or 6 months. We sincerely hope that we shall carry on the Bible business with a mutual good understanding, believing it necessary to ensure a mutual advantage," quote unquote. This mutual advantage was the understanding that both Collins and Company and Carey and Son would now be competing for customers for their respective family Bibles, Carey in Philadelphia, Collins in New York. Collins could claim, at least make the claim, that its stereotype Bible was a newer, more attractive, and more authoritative innovation than the Carey one, or at least was newer. And they offered Carey a set of plates to this new Bible that they were just starting to create. They said to him, "We shall have 2 sets of our stereotype quarter Bible cast and should be glad to sell thee one of them in preference to any other person in Philadelphia and Baltimore, as it would then not increase the printers of quarto Bibles in the United States. Would it suit thee to purchase and send one set to Pittsburgh or Baltimore? We shall probably sell to some bookseller south of thy city in the course of this year. Suppose thou reflects a little on this subject, and please drop us a line of mail. Thy friends, Collins and Company." They were Quaker printers from New Jersey who had moved to New York in the previous decade. And so with this courteous Quakerish threat to sell a set of potential plates to a potential competitor of Cary's at the same time, Collins clearly hoped to push Cary to agree quickly to purchase a set of plates to get it out of the marketplace or for it to be the Philadelphia set. It didn't work. Cary said, no, I'm not interested. Thank you very much. We will compete as competitors, and that's it. And here's an advertisement for Collins and Company's, a notice of the new Stereotype Bible that they're about to be producing and is almost ready for marketplace. These notices occur all throughout American newspapers, from New England to South Carolina to the Midwest in the 18 teens. Collins also created their own prospectus and sales notice that they would send out to booksellers all over the country, announcing their new Quarto Family Bible with all the variants. And so here you can see 2 pages of it. Following the Cary model, you can see up to at least 50 examples here, 50 variants, all printed from the same set of stereotype plates, Old and New Testament with or without apocrypha, concordances, notes, different sets of paper, and different bindings from about 350 up to about 1850. Collins's prices slightly undercut Cary's for most Bible options. Cary's dominance of the family Bible marketplace was now seriously challenged, and the rapid changes taking place in typefounding and bookselling in New York now made his home base in Philadelphia seem very far away from the center of innovation in the printing trades, which was fast becoming New York within a several square block area of Lower Manhattan, where all these stereotypers and typefounders were starting to produce plates. Collins also noted that of the plates, they would be selling several other copies and reserving, of course, their own copy for printing as well, flooding the marketplace with family Bibles. 2 years pass, and in 1818, Collins decides to set a new set, a resetting of the Bible text in stereotype of another family Bible. They interest Matthew Cary, and Matthew Cary bites. He agrees to purchase a set of their second stereotype family Bible and pays for it about $4,000, about $4 a plate, gets it over a period of several months, shipped very circuitous ways from New York to Philadelphia. And Cary promptly warehouses the plates for 2 years, still printing from his standing type family Bible. 2 years pass, and he engages a subscription agent in New York to scout out prospects for what he's calling a Cary's Stereotype Bible, a Splendid Bible, and on occasion a $50 Bible. He's trying to capture the high end of the marketplace. And his subscription agent spends a couple weeks scouting the universe. And after the Panic of 1819, a $50 Bible, which is twice the price of any family Bible in the marketplace to date, was clearly untenable, to say the least. And so Cary he actually prints a prospectus for this $50 Splendid Family Bible and then withdraws it and regroups and starts to go back to the old model of just printing a stereotype family Bible, but his first one. Upon examination of his warehoused plates that he didn't touch apparently for 2 years, he finds a lot of the plates damaged in transit. Apparently he or his printers never even took them out of their crates to examine them. And Cary loses an entire year wrangling back and forth with Collins and Company about corrections and repairs and replacements to damaged plates. Finally, Cary brings out an edition of his Stereotype Family Bible in 1823, 4 years after taking ownership of the plates. And it would be the only edition or impression of a Stereotype Bible printed by Cary and Son and its successor firms. Carey & Son would also print one final impression of the family Bible from standing type in 1824, a year after he printed his stereotype edition. And by this time, 1824, the United States family Bible market was completely different from the one that he had dominated just a couple decades prior, earlier in the century. Many competitors across the country were now publishing similar or cheaper editions, and the American Bible Society was successfully carrying out its mission to distribute inexpensive copies of the Bible to all parts of the United States. Carey & Son would abandon the Bible business entirely in 1824. Okay, I'd like to jump ahead now to another example, considering some of the afterlives of plates as they come out onto the marketplace. And just as a little lagniappe, here is two advertisements from Norton's Literary Gazette, showing that the plates to Charles Follen's German Reader and his German Grammar first appeared for sale in January of 1852. This is a work that was over 20 years old. Charles Follen was the first professor of German at Harvard and wrote the first German grammar for United States audience. But by the time had long since died, he was a transcendental fellow traveler and very interesting person. But by the time the plates appeared on the marketplace in 1852, the book had been out for over 20 years in multiple impressions. And there were newer, more advanced, better German grammars being produced. And so the stereotype plates for these two books languished in the trade, unsold. In this case, for almost 3 years. Their final appearance in the trade newspaper was from November 1st, 1854. For sale, very cheap, the stereotypes and copyright of the grammar for all of $1.12 63 cents, forlorn and forgotten at that point. But what I really want to talk about is Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave and the afterlife of its stereotype plates. And I'll be quicker than with the Carey example. Solomon Northup's memoir, 12 Years a Slave, it was jointly published in 1853 by the Auburn, New York firm of Derby and Miller, its Buffalo branch, Derby, Orton, Mulligan, Cincinnati, Henry Derby. Subsequent impressions, the publisher is given as Derby, Miller, and Osgood and Miller, Orton and Mulligan, as you can see here in the 1856 impression, the 29,000th, all printed from the same set of stereotype plates. Derby and Miller were a general interest publisher of school books, popular histories, and literature in upstate New York. That same year, 1853, it published the best-selling Fern Leaves from Fanny's Portfolio by the popular author Sarah Peyton Willis, also known as Fanny Fern. Northup's work was published simultaneously in England as well by the established London firm of Sampson Low and Company. Textually, the first London edition matches its American counterpart exactly. The setting of type is exactly the same as between the two editions, and so 2 stereotype plates to it were made in the United States, one of which was sent to England and published there first to secure the British copyright. All the impressions of the work in the antebellum period came from the same set of stereotype plates. On the image on the right, the stereotype plates to 12 Years a Slave were offered for sale at the spring 1859 New York trade sale, not by its original publishers, but in a large lot of 42 sets of stereotype plates offered by another firm, Campbell and Smith, which had not published an edition of it under its own imprint. These plates presumably sold at the trade sale to another publisher, as then this edition of 12 Years a Slave appeared later that year, 1859, under the New York imprint of C.M. Saxton. Saxton, interestingly, was known primarily as a publisher of agricultural and horticultural books and the journal The Plow. So he presumably saw a bargain at the trade sale for some sort of steady seller about plantation life in the South for his primary agricultural audience, one that could bring a modest return, despite the fact that tens of thousands of copies of this book had already been in circulation in the United States over the previous 6 years. The next edition of 12 Years a Slave was published just after the Civil War in Philadelphia by the Keystone Publishing Company, cheap reprint publishers. It too was printed from the same set of plates as the 1853 Auburn and the 1859 New York editions. But in this edition, the two-page editor's preface on pages 15 and 16, which had appeared in all the previous editions and impressions, was replaced by a new two-page publisher's preface, the image on the right, which begins, "Slavery is now one of the institutions of the past." The same set of plates was used to print the book's text, including the original table of contents plate on the left, which listed actually the older editor's preface on page 15 and 16, not the new publisher's preface. And the plate had not been corrected to note this new publisher's preface. They just let the incorrect note slide. Keystone chose to cast a new plate, two plates for the publisher's preface in order to note the abolition of slavery in the United States, but not to correct the table of contents. And then one final edition of 12 Years a Slave appeared in the 19th century, published in New York by the International Book Company, even cheaper reprint publishers, sometime around 1890. And it too was printed from the same set of plates as the 1853 first edition and all subsequent editions. And it included the postbellum publisher's preface and the incorrect title page, editor's preface. But by this time, the copper plate illustrations used in each previous edition had long since worn out and were not included. The list of illustrations on the bottom half of the last page of the table of contents in the Keystone edition on the left was then altered, and the plate was cut up and altered to remove the list of illustrations for the International Book Company edition. Otherwise, the setting of the text is identical, right down to the misnumbered editor's preface at the beginning of the table of contents. And after that, presumably worn down from 40 years worth of thousands of impressions and at least 5 different owners, the plates and the work itself disappear from the marketplace. I hope those two examples flesh out some of the human stories behind the decisions to make and trade and sell and use some of these plates in commerce and the meanings that are generated. I'm happy to stop now. I've talked long enough. I'd be happy to field questions and comments and hope to hopefully clarify myself a little bit too. I welcome any thoughts. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Like I said before we started the program, I've been waiting for this book, so I'm very, very happy that it's out. And we have several questions, so I'm going to go right to them. We've got about 10 minutes, which I think is good. I think we can get through what we've got. And please, I encourage anyone out there who is participating in the webinar, if they have a question, just to type it into the Q&A. So our first question is, could an expert tell the difference between a book printed using a stereotype plate and one printed using movable type?
Short answer, no. No, they're indistinguishable. You can tell certainly when subsequent editions over spans of multiple decades get reprinted, like I just showed with 12 Years a Slave. If you look at the setting of type and the way the page is set up, absolutely identical settings, and also settings of type that eventually start to wear down as these plates get reprinted through thousands of times over multiple impressions, and owners start to break down. Then you can fairly determine, okay, maybe this was from one set of plates or the same setting of multiple plates. Again, multiple copies of the same set of plates could be generated at the time they were generated, multiple copies sent off to England, a copy kept in the United States. So there are the multiplicative possibilities of plate generation complicates 19th century bibliography and bibliographic study immensely. And that's what I find, the messiness that I find of all this universe is very attractive. You really have to look for other clues. You know, you can look to see, is an E been nicked in page 32, paragraph 1 of this impression, and then look at subsequent impressions to see if that nick repeats. Then you might think, oh, well, maybe this is the nick in the plate rather than in a subsequent resetting of type too.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just going to keep going with questions because I don't want to have anybody left off our list here. Were publishers sending stereoplates back and forth across the Atlantic?
Yes, I've got some evidence of American publishers sending them to England, especially to get copyright precedents and get an edition struck off first. And then also what I didn't mention, but I talk about in the book a little bit, the example of William Wells Brown, of course, the ex-enslaved man and abolitionist speaker who generates a set of plates to his narrative and literally carries them with him across the Atlantic as he goes on an abolitionist antebellum lecture tour to England and Ireland, just like Frederick Douglass had done before him. Douglass didn't take plates to his narrative, but William Wells Brown did. He also brought a spiked slave collar with him. So imagine William Wells Brown in customs in Liverpool. He notes this in his letters, in his correspondence. Crates of stereotype plates to his narrative, his own life story embodied in a material text, together with the spiked slave collar, checking them through customs and about to go off and meet an Irish and a British publisher to have these copies struck off into paper again, editions to sell on his lecture tours. So yes, I've found less evidence of plates moving from England to America.
I'm going to actually follow up on that conversation there because there's another question about how big and heavy would Sojourner Truth's narrative have been? She couldn't have carried them around, obviously, but how much storage space would the plates have required?
Right. So if you can imagine, a page, a size of a page impression, so 4 by 8 inches, let's say. The plate is fairly thin. It's not type height. It's not 0.918 inches. It's just a thin plate that is then beveled at the edges and might be hollow underneath because of the raised surface of it. So it will certainly be heftier than, it'll be lighter than a form of type that's type height full, but still a substantial amount of weight. These plates were boxed into little crates with slotted wooden slots, 24 plates per box or so. So you can imagine each small box, 24 pages weighing anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 pounds, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so a 1,000-page stereotype Bible sent in 25 crates over multiple shipments from New York to Philadelphia to Matthew Carey, for example, or a 200-page narrative contained within 10 to 12 boxes, small crates of plates. Much easier to warehouse than paper stock, but still requiring a substantial amount. And there are stories about Harper and Brothers just completely, they built a new building in 1853 in New York City, state-of-the-art, stereotype warehouse in the basement, fireproof vault, but within 5 years, they're running out of room because they're stereotyping everything, all their novels, their magazine, everything. And so the accumulation of plates also becomes a burden for publishers as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and did Truth? I think I remember reading from the manuscript. Did Truth leave her plates with a printer? So she wasn't actually.
She had friends who would hold them in trust for her, and as she came, back to Battle Creek and stayed at home for some time, she would correspond and just arrange to have a new impression of her narrative struck off. Basically,
sort of a practical approach to.
Mm-hmm.
So next question is, how common is it to come across these plates today in good enough condition to create a legible print?
They pop up on eBay, single, mostly electrotype plates from the late 19th, early 20th centuries. I have yet to find a complete book in plates, in crates coming up at auction, but they exist. A couple libraries around the country have full complete survivors, but for the most part, after they were worn down, they were simply melted down and used for other purposes or for scrap metal. So surviving plates are still pretty scarce, I'd say.
Yeah, we have a handful.
Yes, there's a couple. There's some at our bookstore. There's some all around the country.
Yeah. How were stereoplates created in a curved manner without distortion for use on a cylinder press?
It was a curved mold. It was basically just using the same technology, curved setting of type in a curved mold, and then just immersed and flooded with type metal to create a curved plate. So
storing those, man.
just a refinement or enhancement of it. And yeah, and those rotary plates again would get they do not survive. They were melted down and reused because they're mostly used for newspapers and periodicals rather than book production.
So we have a couple of questions here about illustration. So I'll try to combine these so we can cover as many as possible. Was this process used for reproductions of maps? For example, in large editions by Julius Bean, who printed maps for the US government. So there's a map question. And then the other question is, when the illustrations were left out of Northrup's text, wouldn't the spaces be blank where the prints were supposed to go? So there's sort of this, how do you adjust?
Okay, so I'll do the second one first because that's easy. There were copperplate impressions. So they would have been printed by a separate process, tipped into the book. So there would have been no change in pagination in the text of the narrative. The illustrations would just be gone because there were, there were no copperplate impressions able to be struck off and included. So it would have just been a straight ahead unillustrated edition. And I found not so much for maps and reproducing our images, but for cuts. So stock images, the famous image of the runaway enslaved person that appears throughout newspaper advertisements in the 19th century, real estate advertisements, all those little houses that you see. So if you look at publishers, printers and typefounders specimen books, you find pages and pages of stereotype cuts. The advantage, of course, is that you could go larger. So instead of having a small wood engraving, you could have a larger wood cut that then gets stereotyped, or a large multiple piece wood engraving block could then get stereotyped
as one.
Hundreds or thousands of copies of that generated and then sold as just part and parcel to print shops all over the country. So there's uniformity and scale of reproduction of those sorts of cuts was another advantage of stereotyping. It lent itself wonderfully to that sort of copying.
So this is a good question, actually, and I can attest that this is actually addressed in the book. But the question is, how often were stereotyped plates extensively edited or repaired?
They necessarily had to be. If Collins and Company ran into this, the American Bible Society, of course, ran into this as they were commissioning shops to set a Bible in standing type, stereotype it, generate a plate. The American Bible Society was hiring a full-time corrector, proofer and corrector for its plates right after the first 2 years of its existence, because angry ministers were writing in to them complaining about textual inaccuracies. And so you had to take the plate and with a chisel and a saw and a file and a bevel, take out the offending passage and replace it with type metal, solder it in, cut it off, shave it, bevel it, and physically correct the plate. It was time consuming, it was problematic. And so there was obviously a need for great proofing of your text before the plates were made. But even then, it was never 100%, as we all know, for typos.
Exactly.
They always get it. And so I included as an appendix in this book, the American Bible Society's directions for repairing plates, which I found fascinating.
Me too.
They had that experience, refined to such a place where they had to share that with other people.
Yeah, write it down, how to do it. Do you think there is any significance to the fact that the Book of Mormon, published 1830, was represented by Joseph Smith as a translation and transcription of ancient golden plates?
Short answer, yes. And I would direct the reader to Sonia Hazard's recent article last year. It was called, Sonia Hazard, it was called How Joseph Smith Encountered Printing Plates and Founded Mormonism. It was in the journal Religion and American Culture. And she, made the Thomas Huxley analogy to Darwin. She said what people were thinking. Joseph Smith was in upstate New York at a period of time when printers and publishers in Rochester and Poughkeepsie and Albany were all either commissioning, making plates, or printing from plates in their print shops. When Smith in Palmyra had the Book of Mormon revealed to him at the Hill Cumorah. So he was aware of this new technological innovation at the time. And I'll say no more and direct the reader to Sonia Hazard.
Fair enough. Would an author's revised edition with both small and large changes, I'm thinking Whitman here too myself, but the question is not based on Whitman, require all new plates if they existed for earlier editions?
And again, I suppose it depends on the quantities of revisions necessary.
Yeah, I think that's right. They might be something small, they could do it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the other thing is that some publishers would use the same setting of type and generate two different sets of plates to it. So a large deluxe edition in 2 columns, and then a smaller edition too. So there are different ways of getting around that to bring out fancy big books and then reset the type quickly, generate a new set of plates to it, and have a cheaper edition as well. So there are all sorts. Again, the 19th century is really messy in terms of printing technologies, and that sort of figuring that out is the fun part. But yes, all those options were theoretically possible and probably employed at one point or another.
We still have a lot of questions. I'm going to sneak in 2 more just because we're just after 3 o'clock. When the serigraph plates are sold, does the author get compensated for a new edition, especially if it's an international reprint, or is the attached copyright a single payment to the author? How does that work?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of different publishing copyright models too in the 19th century, but in the early period, oftentimes the copyright was sold along with the printing rights to the work. And so if a set of plates was generated, the publisher owned both the plates and the copyright to the plates. And if they went bankrupt, the plates, along with their respective copyrights, went out onto the marketplace and were sold and resold without any input from the author themselves. And then later on, once large publishers start to innovate, all sorts of other joint ventures come into play where authors pay up front out of their royalties for the cost of generating their plates. And then if the plates are sold, they may get a first right of refusal for buying them back, maybe at cost, maybe at a discount. This happens with Herman Melville and other authors. And then other times, simply different models happen as well. The author may sell rights to the publisher for a set number of years, after which they expire, and then the publisher takes them over. So again, the 19th century.
And I'll push the book a little bit to say there's a terrific tracing of Melville and his struggles with this exact question. So definitely, if that's an area that you're interested in, copyright's an area of interest, or the authorship, or how did authors control these things, that Longfellow is mentioned as well in the book. So there's a lot of great description there, but I'm going to wrap it up here, even though we have just a few more unanswered questions. And I want to thank you, Jeff, very much for the book itself, but for taking your time today to present it to us. And it really is hot off the press. So be sure to take that code out of the chat for folks here. And thank you all for coming. This is our last program of 2022. But we'll be back in mid-January with a new entry in the Perspectives from the Collection series. So please keep an eye out on the AAS website for updates. Many of our previous programs are available to view on our YouTube channel too, so you can check those out. And this one will be up there within a week or so. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jeff. Really so much appreciated. And please, everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you all so much.